Hello, everyone. Welcome to this time of Bible study. I'm so glad that you are taking time out to watch this video. I've lost track of how many weeks into the COVID shutdown we are. I think it's still in the 30s somewhere. I think it's more than 35. Whatever it is, I'm so glad that we can stay connected like this through this video. You know, we're worshiping remotely, as a lot of churches are doing, but we're still connected. We're connected through this time, the worship hymns that Mary's doing and through the Bible studies that we're doing together. More importantly than that, we're connected through the work of the Holy Spirit, who is always at work within the body of Christ. So I'm glad that you are here today. Last week I preached from the life of Abraham, and we saw what happens when you put faith into practice. I had so much I wanted to share with you from the life of Abraham. Way too much to put into one sermon, way too much to put into two sermons, honestly. But I'm going to do one more sermon today from the life of Abraham. I want to share with you this message under the heading of Lessons from the Life of Abraham. But of course, they're lessons that Abraham learned, but they are lessons for us today as well. As I mentioned to you last week, the story of Abraham plays out through a large chunk of the book of Genesis. We first encounter Abraham right at the end of chapter 11. His death and burial is recorded in Genesis 25. So that whole section of Genesis is devoted to his life. There's so much there, so many important spiritual lessons that we learn, and I want to share 4 of them with you today. These are lessons from the life of Abraham that will help us in our spiritual journeys as well, okay? Lesson number 1 is that God puts a premium on faith. You know, it would be great. I talked about doubt a few months ago, maybe a couple of months ago. It would be great if God just, would appear to everybody who had doubts. If God would just appear to them and say, here I am. You don't have to doubt if I exist anymore. Here I am. But he doesn't. We have to have faith. It would be great if, God would send us a postcard from heaven with a postmark from heaven on it, pictures of heaven, and say, you don't have to doubt about heaven anymore. Here are the photos. You can look at them. Heaven is real. But we don't. He doesn't. We just have to have faith. It'd be great if we could have that kind of a certainty that we have in mathematics, that 2 + 2 = 4. It's always 4. There's no uncertainty about that. Or if we could have the kind of certainty that we have in science, that when one atom of hydrogen, 2 atoms of hydrogen chemically bond with 1 atom of oxygen, we have water, always, but we don't. Or if we could have the kind of certainty that we have in geography, where every map you look at, Portugal is right next to Spain. It's always that way. We're accustomed to that type of certainty in life. So to live a life of faith, where everything that we believe, everything that is dear to us in our religion, we believe by faith, it's difficult. I don't know why God does that. It's known only to God. I just know that he does, that God places a premium on faith. He did that with Abraham, for example. When Abraham set out on his journey, you remember what I told you last week, that God said to Abraham, I want you to go to a place that I'm going to lead you to. I'm going to show you. He didn't tell Abraham at the beginning where it was. Abraham set out on his journey, not even knowing where he was going. God could have said to him, he could have shown him a map and pointed to the place on the map and said, now look, this is the place you're going. This is how long it's going to take to get there. You won't have any trouble along the way. It's all going to be good. But he didn't. He just told Abraham, start walking, and along the way I'll share with you where you're going. He could have said to him when he made the promise that I'm going to give you a son, and that through him you'll have descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and that your descendants will be a blessing to all the people on earth. And he could have told Abraham exactly when that son was going to be born, but he didn't. I'm sure that Abraham thought it would be any day now, or any day now they would get the word that Sarah was pregnant, that the baby was 9 months away. But in fact, it was 24 years before Isaac was born. God could have told him that at the beginning. Now, you're going to have to wait 24 years, so don't get impatient, don't lose hope along the way, but he didn't. Abraham had to live by faith day by day. In fact, when God called Abraham, that's the one thing that he required of him, that he had to have faith. And everything that happened in the life of Abraham, everything that we know about today, everything that we celebrate today, we celebrate because Abraham had faith. It is exactly the same with you in your Christian life. Everything about your Christian life is an act of faith. You entered into the Christian life through faith. That's what the Bible tells us. Romans 3:28, Paul wrote, "Therefore we are justified by faith, apart from the works of the law." You live each and every day now as a Christian by faith. Paul wrote this in Romans 1:12, "The just shall live by faith." And that was the foundational verse, by the way, of the Protestant Reformation. The just shall live by faith. He says it even more explicitly in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 when he writes, "We walk by faith and not by sight." The book of Hebrews says it even more explicitly than that, and it makes two startling statements about faith. This is Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. "Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him." Now, there are at least two absolutes in that verse, maybe three, depending upon how you count them, but for certain, there are at least two absolute statements about faith in that verse. One of them is that you cannot please God without faith. Did you notice how he wrote that? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. He doesn't say it's unlikely. He doesn't say it's difficult. He says it is impossible. If you don't have faith, you cannot please God. That's an absolute statement from the scriptures. The second one is that anyone who comes to God must believe that he exists. And underscore two words there, must, that's the absolute part of it. What must you do? You must believe that he exists. Not that you are certain, not that you have proof. You must believe that he exists. And as a Christian, however much longer you live on this earth, you will live every day as an act of faith. You will walk by faith. You will live by faith for the rest of your life, every single day. Why? Because God places a premium on faith. So that's lesson number one from the life of Abraham. Lesson number two, that was more of a challenge to live by faith. Lesson number two is part of the blessing of faith. And here it is. Here's the second lesson from the life of Abraham. Faith provides courage for life's challenges and comfort for life's troubles. There were all sorts of challenges and troubles along the way for Abraham. I hope you'll take some time to read his story from the end of Genesis 11 through Genesis 25. There were all sorts of challenges. He had to wait 24 years for God to fulfill his promise, or the first part of the promise, for his son to be born. Along the way, as they were traveling through Egypt, the Pharaoh took a liking to Abraham's wife, and Abraham lied and said Sarah was his sister because he thought Pharaoh would have him killed if he knew that Sarah was married. And so Sarah gets confiscated and taken to the Pharaoh's palace to be part of the Pharaoh's harem. Later on, After Isaac was born and after he had grown up at least some, he was probably still a child, but he was grown enough to walk and do chores, God asks for Abraham to give Isaac back to him. And of course, it seemed if Abraham did that, that God would have been reneging on his promise, that there's no way to fulfill his promise of descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky if Isaac didn't even reach age to have children of his own. There were all sorts of challenges along the way. Abraham had no idea how God was going to keep his promise. He just believed that he would. And that faith gave Abraham a tremendous amount of comfort and reassurance. I don't know how much trouble Abraham anticipated along the way, maybe none at all. I know a lot of us start our Christian lives believing that, now that I'm a Christian, my life is just going to be easy. There'll never be any sickness. There won't be any disappointment. There won't be any difficulties. I belong to God now. He's just going to protect me every step of the way. Other people will have trouble, but not me. And of course, we learn along the way that that's not the case at all. That we do have troubles, we do have difficulties, sometimes illness, maybe death comes to our family. And our faith gives way to fear because our focus shifts from God to our circumstances. That's what Abraham did along the way. But when you truly come to believe that there is nothing that is too hard for God, when there is nothing that God can't do, that God can do the impossible, it's amazing the amount of comfort and reassurance that will give you. And so do what Abraham did. Lean on your faith. Lean on your faith in God to get you through life's toughest times. You find any mature Christian who's been a Christian for a while, and they will have a testimony to share with you that your faith in God will comfort you and get you through life's most difficult challenges. Years ago, I think this was maybe around 1980, 81, something like that, I had the opportunity to meet one of my preaching heroes, John Claypool. John was a Baptist minister, but really kind of an unusual Baptist minister. He was one of the, in my opinion, one of the great Protestant preachers of the last 50 years. He was just a magnificent preacher. He developed what came to be known as the confessional style of preaching. Claypool wasn't way up there in the lofty tower, ivory tower, telling you how a perfect person lived. He preached from a confessional point of view. His book, Tracts of a Fellow Struggler, had a great impact on me and my own preaching style, helping me to develop, my own voice. So I had a great deal of admiration for John Claypool, and his preaching had a great impact on me. A friend of mine knew John Claypool, and I was pastoring around New Orleans at the time, just outside of New Orleans, and he said to me, "Would you like to meet John Claypool?" And I said, "Well, of course." And he said, "He's here in New Orleans right now." He had resigned his church, and John had gone through a tremendous amount of difficulty. His youngest child, a daughter, Laura, had died from leukemia at age 10 after about a year and a half of just a devastating time, a torturous time of illness for her, and she finally died at age 10. And then he and his wife split. His wife divorced him. And by the way, if you're not familiar with this, the divorce rate among couples who lose a child is just astronomically high. Each one of them is so grief-stricken. Their grief is just too much for the other. And it happens so often that these couples end up divorcing. And that's what happened to John. So at the time that I met him, it was arranged for us to have lunch together. He had resigned his church and was doing an internship, a chaplaincy internship at Baptist Hospital in New Orleans. It was one of the top, maybe two chaplaincy training programs in the South, the other one being in Atlanta. So John was there 40 hours a week, doing this chaplaincy internship. And my friend arranged for John and I to have lunch together. And I went and met him. We ate lunch there at the cafeteria at Baptist Hospital. And, again, John had that past year, when I met him, that was the year after, his child had died, and then he and his wife had divorced. And man, he had been through a difficult time. But he said something to me I've never forgotten. He recounted for me all of these troubles that he had been through, how difficult his life had been. And he said to me, this past year, I have been to the bottom. And he paused a little while, and then in a big smile, he said to me, and the bottom held. And he went on to say that in the most difficult moments of his life, his faith in God had gotten him through. And so that's the second lesson from the life of Abraham, that faith will give you courage for life's challenges, and it will give you comfort for life's trials. Now, lesson number 3 from the life of Abraham is that with God, all things are possible. Remember, I told you last week that when Sarah, at age 90, Abraham's wife, when the messenger finally came and stood outside their tent and said to Abraham, who was 99 and Sarah was 90, the time is fulfilled. God is going to fulfill his promise. Sarah is going to have a baby. Sarah overheard that and she literally laughed out loud. And the messenger said to Abraham, why is she laughing? Is anything too hard for God? Boy, that's a great question, isn't it? It's a rhetorical question, of course, because the messenger already knew the answer. The answer is no. There is nothing that is too hard for God. And everything that Abraham did afterward happened because Abraham believed the answer to that question was no. There is nothing that is too hard for God. Abraham believed that God could place a baby in the womb of a barren woman who was decades past childbearing age. Abraham believed that God could make a nation out of the descendants of a man who had no descendants. He even believed that if necessary, God could raise a dead child back to life. And that's lesson 3 from the life of Abraham. And that is that with God, all things are possible. And here's the lesson, number 4. God keeps his promises. That's lesson number 4 from the life of Abraham. God keeps his promises. Abraham's life was so improbable, so, out there in terms of what God asked him to do and what he ended up doing. I mean, think of it. Leave your home and your homeland and go to a place that I'll show you along the way. Worship me only. This is the beginning of monotheism in terms of the world's 3 great theistic religions. It begins right here when Abraham turns his back on polytheism and sources outside of the Bible. We don't know much about Abraham's father from the Bible. We know his name. But historical sources from outside the Bible tell us that Abraham's father was an idol worshiper and that he actually made his business making idols. He made and sold idols. Again, that's an extra biblical source that we know that. But, at the time, and of course, polytheism continued way on into the Old Testament period. There were no percentages in giving up polytheism. It wasn't just a question of, do you worship one God or worship many? Those who were polytheists believed that every God had its own function. There was a God who controlled the weather. There was a God who controlled commerce. There was a God who controlled wealth, and on and on. So to turn your back on all these other gods would mean that if you believed in that kind of thing, that you're giving up all that that particular God could promise you. And so when God calls upon Abraham to worship him and him only, what he's saying to Abraham is, I want you to trust me that I will be sufficient for every aspect of your life. And of course, Abraham did that. And then trust me that I can fulfill this promise to give you and your wife a child when Sarah's decades past her childbearing years. Later on, trust me when I ask you to give this child back to me. Trust me that I'm still going to keep my promises. I mean, how many times over the years did Abraham wonder if God was really going to keep his promises? How many times did he wonder if God had forgotten him? Remember, the promise was not only for a child. It was the promise that there would be so many descendants through that child that they would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And even beyond that, that through the descendants of Abraham, that the world, the entire earth would be blessed. And that's a messianic promise. That's not just about the Jewish people. That's a promise about Jesus, that ultimately through the line of Abraham, the Messiah would be born who would bless the entire earth. And of course, God kept his promise. Abraham and Sarah had a child, and the baby's name was Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father or the ancestor of David, and of course David was the ancestor of Jesus. As we read on in the Old Testament, some 600 years later or so, Abraham's descendants are as numerous as the stars of the sky. In fact, they're living in Egypt now. They had gone there centuries earlier because of a famine in the Promised Land. They go to Egypt. They lost their faith. God told them, stay put, I'll take care of you, and they didn't believe that. And they went to Egypt where they heard there was plenty of food. And of course, they ended up in 436 years of slavery in Egypt. And their numbers had become so great that the Pharaoh was worried. There's so many of them now, they could raise up their own army and overthrow me. And Pharaoh, now think about it, the most important, the most powerful man on earth gives an order that every male child of the Hebrews here in Egypt is to be killed below a certain age, every one of them. When the most powerful man on earth gives an order, it's carried out. But if that order had been carried out, the descendants of Abraham would have been wiped out and God's promise would not be fulfilled. So what happened? Well, of course, Pharaoh's order wasn't carried out. And the descendants of Abraham continued to flourish. You see, when Pharaoh gave that order, he didn't know that 600 years before he was even born, God had made a promise to a wandering Mesopotamian that if you will trust me, and if you will worship me and me only, I will give you a son, and through that son, your descendants will become so numerous that they will be like the stars in the sky. And through your descendants, the Messiah will be born, and the entire earth will be blessed. Pharaoh didn't know about any of that. But his order could never have been fulfilled because one of the great lessons from the life of Abraham is that God keeps his promises. Even when things look hopeless, God keeps his promises. Now, these lessons from the life of Abraham, they're not just for Abraham. They're for you and me today. I know right now I am speaking to someone who is going through a tremendous challenge. It may be financial. It may be health. It may be your faith is wavering. It may be that the COVID shutdown has ruined your business or who knows what. Only God and you know what it is. I want you to cling to these lessons from the life of Abraham because they are just as valid today as they were 4,000 years ago when Abraham was alive. Here they are again, lessons from the life of Abraham that are for you and me today. God places a premium on faith. Don't lose your faith. Even when you feel like you can't believe, keep believing, keep trusting God. God places a premium on faith and he rewards faith. Number two, faith provides comfort in times of life's troubles and it provides courage in times of life's challenges. Number three, with God, all things are possible. Even when you don't know how, God knows how. Even when you can't see it, how it's going to be done, God has already figured it out. And number four, God keeps his promises. There are thousands and thousands of promises in God's word. Every single one of them was written for you. All right, I'm so glad that you took time today to share in this video with me. I'm praying for you. Pray for my church family every day. Praying for all of you who are having troubles, at least all of you that I know about what your troubles are. Pray for you each day as well. I look forward to sharing with you again next Sunday. I hope you'll come back. Until then, may God bless and keep you.